It's great. We're very thankful for everybody who joined. We know you're doing this out of your own time. Nobody's being paid for being here. So that on its own is very incredible. Out of those 50 people who joined in, there were, Ben, correct me, 22 people? Yes, in the back of the
Will has the distribution.
Will, correct me. Will, ooh. How many participants actually generated codes? Okay. So we had, based on Will's computation, we had 22 people, 21 people who actually consented, were ready to roll up their sleeve and generate concept sets for phenotypes that they didn't know before walking into this room today and were randomized to. So that's also another amazing achievement that we had 21 participants from the community, not part of the workshop. Didn't know anything about the workshop up to just registering for it, that were ready to use OHDSI tools to generate concept sets and participated in this. You all generated the concept sets. We saw the disagreement and the agreement with the AI. We had 4 amazing AI researchers now that actually took up the challenge. You heard from Joel and Daria and Nico on their workflows. I was personally, I don't know about you, I know a lot about Joel's work, so I'm biased. But I was very impressed with the 2 other LLMs that we heard about today. And also thank you for the anonymous LLM researcher who also submitted his work, or her work, but didn't feel that they want to declare who they are. So we're also grateful for that scientist. Okay, we saw that number 1 we learned already, I don't think we have it on the slide, but we learned already from Gaurav that we had disease that we have very good consistency between the LLM and the machine. It also had, and we had 94% consistency between the machines and the humans on the rheumatoid arthritis. Because of that great consistency, we were like, well, maybe we need the expert to actually judge those concepts that both LLM and human agreed upon. Let's not consider them gold standard because it seems like it's weird that 94% of the codes were actually consistent. So Liz here actually went through the full list of the rheumatoid arthritis and adjudicated those lists. So she will tell us what she found because she was the only expert who were actually sent not only the disagreement but also all the full list of rheumatoid arthritis codes. So we can learn a little bit about what it means that both human and how good is that from an expert opinion. Okay, we also learned that we had conditions from about 5 conditions that had very, very poor overlap. And it was DVT. We had less than, 24 or something like that. So basically, you're more likely to have an agreement if you just flip a coin, like worse than the chance. And we had 2 conditions that were a flip of a coin. So we learned that. The teams now are getting the adjudicated list, and based on the adjudicated list, which will now be considered the gold standard. So let me clarify, what is the gold standard that F scores will be computed upon? It is the list of code for every condition that consistent of the full agreement, so that's what we call intersection in logic. All the codes that all human, like the human arm, and all 4 LLM arm included a code. If both the human and the 4 LLM code included a code, it becomes part of the gold list standard. Anything that they didn't agree on is the one that got adjudicated. So in addition to the full agreement, we're going to add to the gold standard list the codes that the adjudicator said they are true cases, true codes. So now the gold standard is basically a code list that consists of codes that LLM, ARMs, and humans included, plus an adjudicator included based on their opinion. And that would be the gold standard. Compared to that gold standard now, we're able to compute the performance of each LLM and each human, each human table. Because we also split you, and we had two human concept set. We can also learn how much improvement we got between when a human work alone, when humans come together and have consensus. We in J&J learned that when we build concept set, because it's a slightly subjective task, we get to not actually, when we do it independently and we come back together, we have a lot of inconsistency. It always depends on what you're working on. I'm sure if you're working on, we learned that, yeah. Rheumatoid arthritis seemed to be a not very big question. Yeah, go ahead.
What about the chronic versus acute?
What about the chronic?
Defining chronic versus acute. I went from defining a chronic disease to defining acute, trying to reconcile an acute condition.
Okay, let's hear new reflection. So what we want to do in the next 20 minutes, we want to hear your reflection on the process. So let's start with the participants, how you thought about it, how you selected code, and if you got to sit next to an adjudicating a different condition, but any reflection on the process, any reflection from that reconcile. There's many dimensions that are going to be generalizable across our condition. The idea of concept, the idea of chronic, acute, the idea of exacerbation. Sure. So Ben, let's hear from you what you learned. You wanna? Yeah. We want to hear you.
Yeah. So in the background, the team is has locked all the concept set expressions. DVT is pending. We can't do the analysis till DVT is done. So pressure on you, Evan.
No, I think you skip one of them.
You can skip?
All right. So lunch is actually at 12:30. So if you guys want to still talk, we put at 12 as our final thing, but lunch is all at 12:30. So if you want to stick to lunch, we have 30 minutes extra.
Oh, good.
Thank you for with me to talk.
Got some bonus time.
I never have extra time. This is magical today.
All right.
So I was with the rheumatoid arthritis group, and we had some fairly similar criterion where we were looking primarily at the clinical concepts as SNOMED codes represented, valid codes only, so we really kind of restricted it down. But the code specificity for defining a chronic disease is very different from when I sat over on the DVT table and we're trying to reconcile these codes, and we're really struggling because even though there was a fairly narrow specification in terms of the criterion that we had and the attributes we were looking for, the coding itself doesn't represent that. And Evan was drilling down into the representations to see what the numbers were for each of those codes and each of the expansions on those codes. And we were making literally decisions on, what might be the bias by having 300 people who have a non-acute, chronic DVT in a broader code set that had 17 million people with acute DVT, right? So, is there really, should we include that code or not? And I don't remember which way we went on that one in particular, but again, there was a lot of deliberation because, these broader code concepts are harder when you're trying to define acute conditions that have a very narrow definition of, acute proximal DVT versus rheumatoid arthritis in general without, maybe juvenile RA. So, this one?
All right, hello everybody. Just to echo what Ben said, 'cause I think I'm saying a lot of the same things. This sheet proved to be invaluable for our group because it kept us grounded, kind of stressing the importance of having the question and the study design in your head when you're actually developing your concept set. Many times my table kind of waved the sheet in my face to remind me that I was a little bit off and kind of calibrated me to exclude some things. We were trying to enrich for active disease that was prevalent, that would be used for a comparative effect in the study, and there were many codes such as lupus in remission that would need to be excluded in that type of instance. Also echo Ben's comment about the number of cases. We didn't actually go so far as to quantifying it, but in my mind, I know some things are just very esoteric. This is not coded this way. I suspect it was a very small count. And it would have been nice to have a column, actually, not to critique anything, but if there was a column of a count of cross data sources.
It was part of the design.
It was a drop.
This is a classic Gotham analysis. No, okay. But it would have been interesting. You can imagine almost maybe having some pre-specified rules of if this code exists in less than 1% of the data source you're looking at, how relevant is it going to be? And I guess my last comment is that there were still codes that I just didn't even recognize. So I've never seen it. I didn't even know it was a thing. We were kind of Googling some of these. So even a subject matter expert frequently gets dumped. So those are our takeaways.
Yeah, I think the challenge of the task really depends on the underlying accuracy of the codes. Like for diabetic macular edema, we know it's not coded well. A lot of cases with diabetic macular edema don't have it show up in the ICD codes or SNOMED codes at all, and vice versa. Versus something like proliferative diabetic retinopathy, I just need 5 codes and then we're done. It's good as an outcome, it's good as an indication. So it's just a very different task depending on the disease. And just to echo a lot of the things that have been previously said, yeah, our decision about whether or not to include a concept in our concept set really depended on how we were thinking the phenotype would look, like what the logic would be for how to use these different concepts. So we spent a bunch of time debating clinically significant macular edema, which like for a retina specialist, I'm like, that's for sure diabetic macular edema. We should definitely include it. But my table was like, no, it does not say diabetes in there. You should not include it. So we debated back and forth, and we argued that because the prompt said we're only looking at adults with diabetes already, we could probably use a more inclusive and comprehensive set of concepts as just the diabetic macular edema, because we were already preconditioning on adults with diabetes. So.
I'm sure you guys have more thoughts. Liz, you want to share that?
I ended up doing 2 groups that were a little different because one had a lot of good overlap, the other didn't.
So I did RA and systemic sclerosis. They're both rheumatologic diseases. I'm a rheumatologist, so I see and manage all of them. And then I just wanted to say our table got into like a really interesting discussion that is looking at it like 30,000 feet up. Is it time for this community to kind of educate the clinicians? I know this sounds really weird, but like we're domain experts, we're clinical experts, but when we're coding these visits, I am not thinking about how this is going to come out if we're looking at it from this end, using LLMs or vocabularies or phenotypes. That's the last thing on my mind. And the reality of that is also that no matter how you choose to code your ICD, it's not going to translate to affecting complexity of the visit or even really the billing, which is what institutions care about. That's how we get paid now. It's revenue driven. So there's like this big disconnect. But we have to balance. As clinicians, I also don't want to practice every single day second thinking about this, because we have to prioritize the patient that's in front of us and closing the visit in a timely fashion, right? I can't spend 40 minutes thinking about how to do this. So, but there must be some way to like have this side of the community come together with the clinicians who are actually coding it to come up with a standard that is better, so that there's less of these gaps that you found, especially in the very difficult diseases like lupus or systemic sclerosis. That's just my very high level perspective. If that's another working group, sure, we can start another working group. I understand there are many. But overall, I think for rheumatoid arthritis, which is the primary disease I study and do research on and treat, fairly straightforward, because as the name suggests, it's primarily an arthritis and there are less multisystemic involvements, including lung disease, which is probably the most concerning. That is a contrast from systemic sclerosis, which is skin, but it's also vascular. You have Raynaud's, you have lung disease, you have pulmonary arterial hypertension, you have all these other things. So much more complicated. And I do agree with the prior comments that it depends on what your construct is. And my guess is that when you wrote these study questions, you wanted to make it as diverse as possible, because clinicians are going to be asking different questions. So, but much of what I decided to rule in and out was based on that, and not necessarily on clinically what I think would be sensible or make sense all the time. But that's a true reflection, I think, because then, yes, you do have to tailor it to the study question that you're asking, right? Unless you're being very broad about it. So that's kind of what I felt. But really, again, going back to, I think, my first comment about just the whole how to do this better and how to create, how to decrease the amount of disagreement and all this data sorting that we have to do. Should we target the source first, which is the clinicians who are coding And can we like set up some meetings here or whatever, thought groups or whatever you want to call it, to really think about this? Because I can just tell you, as the one of 3 or 4 clinicians in the room, that is the last thing that we're thinking about. And perhaps we should, if you're an observational data researcher and you're a clinician, I care about both ends. So maybe we should, do that. But I don't know. I welcome any thoughts or perspectives. We can talk later. I also love the fact that you guys picked so many rheumatologic diseases, recognizing that they're hard. It's not like, no offense to hypertension, but hypertension or diabetes. So I think this effort is great. I actually think this kind of stuff should be written up and published. I know that it will be welcomed in the rheumatology sort of AI working research groups and spaces, because I honestly think our field was a little late to join this wave of AI, and we're doing it. But if you want to do some kind of overview of the most difficultly coded rheumatologic diseases, let's do it. You have 2 of us here, and we could get more people.
Voting is coming to us. I do want to comment on something Liz said about the selection of codes. It's actually, maybe it's just the human nature of how imperfect we are as a species. But we use a lot of codes to do our research, right? And one of the things we always think of is to understand what the code is in reality being used for, what is that source of truth of what is the code actually representing? And there are actually so many documents of the code manual. And you would think that that is the truth, right? When you actually go over those coding manuals in ICD-10 and ICD-9, they're actually pretty granular. They give you all these rules, you only use this code if you're, but in real practice, that's not how clinician is selecting codes.
So Dr. Bandian here, and I used to work for Blue Cross Blue Shield a long time ago. He worked for the Blue Health Intelligence and several Blues. One of my mentors, and when I was in South Carolina, billing codes. When you the CPT4 codes, the HCPCS codes, and even the NDC codes, there are deliberate reasons to make a choice. And if that is if you choose a code that you cannot justify, you get into trouble. But if you choose a code that for diagnosis, you don't get into trouble. So the precision and the effort that is put to diagnosis code is significantly less than the precision for procedure codes. And that's just the nature of the billing system, because all you need is something adjacent to the procedure you're doing, not the precision. But on contrast, the electronic health record system, where you type in the patient experience or dictate or ambient listening, in that context, the precision is important because that's a legal document. The condition code is not a legal document. So that's why we see some of these things in structured data, but real-world data includes the unstructured data also, and with large language models interpreting them and converting them into structured data, the evolution of this field of science is going to be on a different trajectory, I think.
Are you saying that Blue Cross upcoded everything?
Most of the Blue Cross still are on mainframe, COBOL. Yeah.
Judith, she's leaving without telling us her.
All right. So we made an executive decision as investigators to cut DVT from the analysis.
No, poor Evan. You want to call her to give her this?
Judy, if you have a few minutes, you can please reflect on your comment and what you do about it.
We also want to hear from Judy, because her experience is, at the end of the day, we're doing research, clinical research, using observational data for a purpose. It's just not to have fun, right? We want to learn about our patients, and in one place in safety, we want to know about the safety of all the medical interventions out there. So if we to use our data, we eventually we're gonna have that microscope to see how good the data, and then we want to have this 200 feet above to know, is it ever going to be useful given all those limitations?
So the thing with the DVT is the thing that was specified was acute proximal DVT, so the thigh, right? But there are codes that said lower extremity DVT. So The thigh is in the lower extremity. So if you include lower extremity, are you being overly inclusive because some of those lower extremity are going to be in the distal part of the leg? Or if you exclude lower extremity, then you're going to miss some of the ones in the proximal. So by requiring it that it be focused on that, I guess the question is, does it, like, if you, and perhaps the proximal thigh DVTs are more likely to break off and become a pulmonary embolism, so maybe there is a reason to try to make that distinction, but by trying to make that distinction, if you just said lower leg DVT, I think it would have been a lot easier to get agreement, and Evan, obviously you can reflect on what your thinking is here, but anyway, I think that made it hard to decide what the scope should be by having these more kind of broad or non-specific codes that you don't know which way to go, to include or to exclude.
Yeah, and
I would expand on that too. If you look into that hierarchy, because that's the challenge is there's a lot of codes loaded on those more. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
I'm sorry, the tree.
Yeah, go. Sorry. Thank you so much.
To add to Judy's observation, there's a when you look at that hierarchy, there's a lot of record counts that are loaded on those more broad terms, right? And the vast majority, if you dig into it, and even if you assume that, because within that concept of lower extremity, you do see distal DVT and proximal DVT, with the vast majority of those loaded on proximal DVT. So if you assume that distribution applies to the more general concept, you would, you definitely, I would say 98% of them are probably proximal DVT, but, and the additional challenge is you're thinking about this as a concept set, not as your phenotype algorithm in totality. So you have a specification, do I just stick with that specification, knowing that I will be definitely missing proximal DVTs by not including that more general term, but also knowing that if I'm making a whole phenotype algorithm, I have the opportunity to add additional logic and additional concept sets that could probably capture that, and that could be tested in the data. So I found that to be quite difficult to adjudicate.
I can add a little color to the thinking process. So I selected the proximal DVT, and that was a debate that Aza and I had very serious.
We fought all weekend before.
So the clinical idea that I wanted to introduce was malignancy-induced thrombosis and embolism. And that's a topic because patients who have malignancy have deep vein thrombosis. And that's, but then Aza was like, that is too difficult to explain and too difficult to understand and absolutely not practical to execute in this 4-hour period. So we had to take a pragmatic choice, and we made this choice to make it proximal deep vein thrombosis. But there was, these are lessons that we have learned, and one of the things that we want to explore as a community is we've looked at concept set in isolation, not cohort definition. Phenotype February is about cohort definitions, complex cohort definitions. If we prepare in advance and agree on clinical ideas like that is meaningful, like Judy explained, then we can phenotype them using both human and AI, because as Darius showed you, there are tools that can do cohort definitions. So, and then we have tools like p-evaluator that's able to assess the performance across a network of data sources, and now we can rank order algorithms built by humans and AI as part of Phenotype February 2026.
It's actually very, very relevant. And if you know anything about phenotyping in OHDSI at least, we always, again, we don't think of phenotypes as code lists, we think of them as phenotypes. And we don't think that any phenotype, no matter how great, you make some design choices when you create your phenotype. And you might spend some time saying, I want this code, but without looking into the data, the idea that there are things that overlap and can exist on the same person is already in your data, and you can actually see that. So one of the way you're going to evaluate those choices, if you follow kind of the workflow we're trying to do in OHDSI phenotyping, is you run the different design choices with certain concepts, without the certain concepts in your data source. And sometimes you learn that that old discussion about certain granularity doesn't matter, because the people who have this code also have that code. So it technically is not going to affect the patients you're going to eventually end up selecting in the data. So if one thing I learned in the last 10 years, that when we start to discuss things clinically and conceptually without looking at the data, many times we spend our time in things that will not affect your design eventually, because things co-occur and so forth.